that we can't be joined by our facilitator, our main organizer, Marlena Wisniak from the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, but no worries, we have an incredible session planned. And so to kick us off, my name is Alia Bhatia. I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a Washington-based not-for-profit, nonpartisan group. And today we have an incredible set of speakers who are really going to contend with this question of what does it mean to build, to foster more meaningful multi-stakeholder participation in the development of AI, really across the life cycle of AI, when we're thinking about AI systems from conception and design to development to deployment and post-deployment as well. And we're going to start us off with a few sort of provocations and thoughts from our esteemed panelists. And then, as I mentioned, sort of kick it off to the group to think deeper about either ways we can foster that participation, but also maybe initiatives that in the room led by organizations you represent to sort of learn and enable that sort of cross-sector collaboration. And we'll also be inviting folks to report out after each of you sort of break out into this discussion. So please, amongst yourself, choose a few facilitators. Will be joining the groups as well to sort of see these questions. But before we start, why is this important? As we know, large language models and other AI systems are already being procured and used and sort of deployed in multiple settings, in public and private spaces. But more often than not, these conversations are being led and sort of centralized in the global north, in industry or G2G, government to government spaces. And that loses out on a lot of very valuable expertise, both from civil society and sort of policy experts, but also a lot of experts who are the most experts and people who are the most affected by the deployment of AI technologies. And so today we want to talk and spotlight a couple of initiatives that are bringing these groups into the conversation. What are some of the considerations we need to have in mind when we try to foster this meaningful participation? Towards what end are we moving? What is participation for, and how do we ensure that it's not a box checking exercise? And then what are policy and regulatory approaches to actually incentivize or put teeth to these efforts by either giving more standards for companies to adhere to and model developers to adhere to, but also enforcement mechanisms when they to ensure that when they don't, we have actual means to make them do so. So first, I'll introduce our panelists and invite them also to give a more in-depth introduction of themselves. To my right, we have Jhalak Kakkar, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University in Delhi. Jhalak has written, co-written, and also steered the development of a lot of resources of evaluating policy approaches to the governance of AI systems, but also thinking critically about, sort of stress testing these claims of who these AI systems sort of purport to help and in what contexts. And then next to her, we have Dhanraj Thakur, who is the sort of inaugural professor and director of the Emerging Technology Initiative at the George Washington University, and I believe the George Washington University Law School as well. So Jhalak, I'm going to start off with you to talk us through a few of the sort of policy or regulatory approaches where we are seeing meaningful participation sort of come up, and what these governance mechanisms, either through laws and policy, but also soft laws, voluntary commitments, etc. What do they incentivize? How have they been effective? And where are we left wanting more?
Yeah. In any new space, there's always a trajectory of figuring out what is relative consensus and where can we start to build norms that then build into sort of voluntary commitments, other forms of soft law, which start to then get codified in the shape of standards, in the shape of regulation, in the shape of other sort of international binding commitments. And there's always like a process and trajectory to do that. I think there's value in having multi-stakeholder conversations to start to build that consensus. But if we look at past experience with, say, social media regulation, I think we stayed in the let innovation happen, we're building consensus phase for too long. And I think there needs to be a cutoff point where we start moving beyond voluntary commitments to more hard forms of law, whether that's standards, whether that's laws and regulations, or even which may not even mandate particular sort of outcomes, but may mandate processes at this stage, right? What are processes you need to integrate into the design and deployment of these systems so that we are able to at least surface what are the kinds of harms and challenges that we are seeing. Because if we don't make that shift over the period of the next couple of years from voluntary commitments into harder, more structured forms of regulation, we will sort of may see a repetition of what we've seen with the history of social media, where platforms ran free. There was no mechanism to hold them truly accountable to these commitments that they were repeatedly making in various forums. And we've seen the sort of mess that we have sort of landed up in because of that. So I think I'll pause here, and then we can come back for more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to pause, because I think it's a good sort of where we've come from. And now when we're trying to build towards a vision of more people to have a role in the development of these new technologies, but also truly saying when it doesn't work for them, what does it look like to have the seat at the table? I'd like to bring Dhanaraj into that part. What are some of the effective characteristics of meaningful external and multi-stakeholder participation? What are we talking about when we're saying we need to have a voice in the conversation? And who is this we?
Great. Thank you, Alia. So also thanks to the organizers to provide a space for this kind of discussion. So when we talk about meaningful participation and how we can effectively engage communities in the design, deployment, and evaluation around AI models, I think it's important to recognize that this is an issue, a problem that is not new. In the same way Jellic was referring to like lessons from the social media regulation world, there are lessons that we can draw from when you look at other technological interventions and how their practitioners and policymakers have sought to include wider communities, targeted communities, and so on in these questions. What ultimately emerges, though, when you look at these past lessons, is a question about power. It's a question about the distribution of power. When we talk about participation and collaboration and building partnerships with communities, with different constituencies, we're in effect talking about how power is distributed and what kinds of decisions are being made by who. For a long time, when you look at the field of international development and how countries in the global south or the majority of the world would put in place different kinds of development projects, what emerged from those kinds of lessons was characterized by a scholar named Chambers back based on his work in the 1890s, is in the supply chain, in the thought process, putting them first, starting with their needs and their concerns. That can ultimately mean, for example, communities, target groups, defining what technology use cases are best for them, which is the reverse of what we see now, where frontier model companies deploy models with the idea of let people figure out what the use case is best for them after the fact, or evaluations after the fact. Another thing that emerged from a lot of that work around effective community participation is recognizing that communities actually have a lot of expertise to analyze their local context and understand what's really needed. And so when we think about the development of language models, for example, how they're developed, what kind of specific contexts, what kinds of linguistic concerns should be included in development of these models, that is often where that kind of analysis can lie. So that's kind of a high level, but I just wanted to bring in this issue that there's a lot of debate and research around this kind of what are the mechanisms of effective participation that precedes AI, but we can learn from that without necessarily needing to start from scratch.
No, I think that's really helpful level setting to begin with, because I think sometimes in the AI policy conversation, there is a lot of ahistoricizing going on of like acting like the development of these technologies necessitate, so complex and like uses this new jargon and necessitates only technical experts in the room. Although we've been here before, we've built other sort of incredibly complex privacy enhancing technologies, for example, with journalists and human rights defenders and others in the room. And your framework of like putting those people who are considered last first brings to mind a framework that Wikipedia has used, where instead of human in the loop, which is like a phrase that's often used in a lot of these contexts where they try to say, oh, let's have human oversight at every stage of the development or testing of a technology, they say, actually, we'll have machine in the loop. We're going to go to people who have these jobs where they're editing individual Wikipedia pages and ask, how can we actually make your life easier? Like what is one task that we could automate? And that's a totally different paradigm shift from, I think, what we're seeing right now in the development of AI technologies, where we're sort of retrofitting a problem to solve after the technology is built, especially in the development of sort of general purpose systems. And so one thing to really think about, I have one last question for this group to tee up the conversation we want to have with the audience. But one thing to think about is also, in contending with AI technologies, what do we mean by AI technologies? There's a lot of bringing in people after the fact to test a system, but there's a lot of work being done, especially in the global south, especially in the African continent, thinking about actually there's an expansive way of thinking about the development or the design of AI technologies that don't just over-index on large language model architectures. We could have smaller models that, take into consideration the compute and the electricity constraints and build different architectures. There are ways to, so I think what that's an example to suggest that there are ways to bring in experts at every stage of the development of technology and the testing of technology, and beyond just, hey, we have this thing, come, tell us if we did good or bad. So to that question of like, hey, did we do good or bad, Jhalak, who should be saying that? Like, who should be accountable in ensuring that structures to incentivize meaningful participation and even beyond just meaningful participation, concepts of right of refusal, who should be accountable in both shaping that and then enforcing that?
I think all stakeholder groups have to play a role in this, right? I think, industry has to be accountable for, what it does, but those norms have to be shaped by, civil society, academia, governments, multilateral bodies. Governments have to be held accountable for sort of DPI infrastructure that, they are creating, for the norms and rules and regulations they are framing to hold industry accountable. And I think, civil society, academia needs to sort of level up and ensure that, we are engaging with the technical aspects of the design of these systems and not having conversations at a 10,000 feet level, but are really getting into the nuance. And I think, communities and grassroots communities and representative organizations have to be involved. And I think we need to sort of dig deeper on what we mean by that community involvement, because I hear a lot of conversation about involving communities, but you can't just like put a community in a room and tell them, give us feedback on this system. So I think there has to be thinking that is really developed around what does that community engagement look like, so that it is not a checkbox activity, but it is a meaningful activity, right? And I think we have to identify at what points along the AI life cycle, which of these actors can play a meaningful role, because not all actors can play a meaningful role at all points of the life cycle. My brilliant colleagues at CCG have just put together a report that we are releasing tomorrow on, AI safety in the life cycle, at various points in the life cycle, like what tools can you use, who should be involved, how can different stakeholder groups be integrated. And I think it's important to recognize that at different points, different stakeholder groups need to play a role. And if we're involving communities at different points, maybe the way we structure that engagement is a little bit different. And it becomes important to involve communities because we're not actually only talking about multilingual systems. We're talking about multicultural systems. And, languages are very often correlated with different cultural contexts. And we have to build all of that in, because if we only look at it from the lens of multilingual systems, I think there's a whole bit of like social context that we're going to really lose out on.
I think that's a perfect segue into Dhanaraj, my question to you. And one thing I didn't mention in my introduction of you is, most recently we worked together and you sort of steered a sort of groundbreaking collection of 4 reports on how trust and safety systems work in low resource languages. And low resource languages, for the folks in the room, is those languages where there isn't a lot of training data and high quality resources to train AI models in. And so a lot of model developers sort of use either synthetic media or poor representations of a poor sort of scant representation of the language to train these systems. And you also wrote specifically the only indigenous language we examined, which was Quechua. So based on that work and all of your other work, what, according to you, are the sort of main costs of not engaging both language speakers, but also contextual experts, subject matter experts, stakeholders that are most affected by the deployment of these technologies? How can, what are the costs, both macro, micro, individual, etc.?
Yeah, I think this is a important question in the sense that, and I think Jolek started to allude to this, that when we think of language, we're not just talking about the means of communication, we're talking about people's identity, our identities. We're talking about means through which we identify and express who we are. And one of the issues that came up in this study of Quechua is an indigenous group of languages throughout South America with over approximately 10 million speakers. So this is a large, significant population. One of the issues that came up through that empirical work when we engaged Quechua communities was concerns about how, as a medium, large language models could potentially enable or continue oppression of their language compared to other languages that were more dominant in the region, for example, Spanish. And what would that mean for the continuation of the use of their language and their own culture and expression and so on, because of the idea of large language models being able to parse and essentially mediate what kinds of terms, expressions, and so on may be expressed, in this case, on social media. So then there's an important question here. This is not just simply about asking ChatGPT to translate a sentence or a paragraph, or asking it, questions about, I don't know, whatever questions people ask about movies or food or whatever. This is essentially, it comes really down to questions about identity, particularly for cultures and contexts that are not within what people refer to as high resource languages, i.e. European languages. So the issues are very significant, and understanding then how to preserve these languages and cultures where there's no increasing use of LLMs becomes equally important. And so these questions are all kinds of mechanisms and tools and so on are very important. What I would add is, in terms of engaging these different communities and groups, it's often not a simple, not just one mechanism. Going back to that study with Quechua, what people pointed out was that who they wanted involved was not just one community. They wanted people like students, society groups, community groups, local governments, and so on, all in the mix in determining what kinds of data should be collected, particularly when you have a range of dialects. How do you own it? How do you own and manage and curate this data? What kinds of models should be developed for what purpose, and so on and so on. There's a significant coordination cost then when we think about trying to effectively engage these different groups. This is quite different from imagining, say, I'm going to develop a model, I'm going to hold a consultation at some conference center, and that's it, on a one-off experience. So there's a cost of current coordination, but it has to be done over time, because as languages evolve, so should the models. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, and I think that those are a lot of the costs, but there's also sort of the intangible costs of things like trust. You know, what happens when you convene affected stakeholders and sort of under the guise of, hey, we're listening to you, we care, we want these systems to work for you, but then actually don't follow up with them, don't sort of offer systems. I recently saw that Anthropic calls this sort of question of context and like language and context as the broccoli problem, where and they gave this example recently in an event in Bangalore where they said, you know, if you use Anthropic systems in Canada and say, oh, you know, can you give me tips on what to eat to remain healthy? It'll recommend things like broccoli and kiwi, which, you know, are not the most popular, if readily available, fruits and vegetables to eat. And so, you know, that's sort of a funny example, but you can think of a lot of more sort of pernicious examples. And then, you know, even from a strictly competitive innovation argument, you know, what happens if you're just not serving people's needs, right? What, in terms of market offerings, but also circumvention. So I think that's a good segue into the sort of conversation we want to foster in these breakout groups. We're going to put the questions on the screen right now. We have 3 questions, which I think lend themselves nicely into asking the questions that we've tried to tee up for you, or give examples towards a broader conversation of, you know, what does meaningful engagement look like? What are sort of approaches to foster and include it, and what does sort of success look like as well? So we'll just put the questions on the screen, please. I would love for folks to break out in rows of 2. Yes, and then this question of what specific parts of the AI lifecycle, you know, I think the panelists up here have given examples from everything from model design to development, but also, you know, evaluation. Who gets to say when a model actually works? What are the metrics that are used to stress test claims made by model developers? And then deployment. What does deployment, post-deployment iteration look like? And how can we do this in a participatory way? So yeah, please break out in groups of 2 rows, and we'll be coming to sort of help supervise, but also facilitate. And we're gonna come back in about 15 minutes. Yeah. No, I would love to hear, yeah. Put that in the group and please report out. Please take notes. We'll also be asking each group to report out. So please, someone resume that leadership role so you can report out what your group discussed.
When we are talking about the point 3, how can we incentivize private sector? Are we also focusing on app development as a layer on top of models, or specifically for?
Lifecycle examples are intentionally broad to try to be inclusive of things like application development built on top of models, you know, deployment, post-deployment to include both evaluation, but iterative testing, redress, things like that. So yes, we're talking about both models, but also applications.
My intervention is with respect to what policy or regulatory measures are needed to improve participatory AI. So,
Please report out.
okay.
Thank you. Yeah, please. This is one group. I think this is one group.
I'm not the lead of the group. I'm not going to be the lead of the group. I'm no expert. Yeah, you guys should just turn around. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
5 minutes left. Please ensure you have a report, someone who will report out, and have 1 to 2 concrete things you will be reporting out. Thank you. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to end the conversations now, but we very much want them to continue. So we invite you to sort of stay in touch with us and each other. But I think let's start with this group, and we're going to have each group sort of present on 1 to 2 recurrent themes that came up in your conversation. You can choose one of the questions to answer more directly, or just sort of give a quick survey of the themes you discussed. And in particular, if there's any examples folks gave of, oh, here's an area where, engaging with this group was successful, or sort of could have been tweaked in the future towards better ends, that would be really helpful as well. Okay, please go ahead. And keep your remarks to, let's say, a minute each.
Can you give some use case on that?
1 minute.
Yeah.
No
Okay.
pressure.
I'll start and then you give example. So my name is Prakash Isral. I lead the AI and agentic AI persistent systems. The first topic which we looked at that, so while we all will have a view of the life cycle, so one of the thing which is introduced called ISO 42001, a standard only for AI systems that has 13 broad dimensions. So it addresses many things. So our point one was looking at the points on the screen here, the data, the AI model design and all that depends on the data, because that is where the lot of biases, ethical aspect, fairness, we talk about that get introduced. So we believe strongly that multi-stakeholders should be introduced at that stage, what data is being used, right? Whether it is a right representative set. Obviously, after that, model design, development, deployment, and then the life cycle follows. So start is very important. Then there may be technology layers in between. We also believe in evaluation as well as towards the end when you are deploying in the customer environment. That is where you get the feedback and you do fine tuning of the models. That is another critical aspect. From a use case perspective, I'll let my colleague also add to that.
Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Brown, so I'm from the UK. I'm from the UK Foreign Office, and we had a fascinating discussion. It's really, really interesting. I think one thing we touched on was the use cases that we need to make in terms of getting that data in the first place. I think another point which I was getting a bit exercised about was how do we measure inclusivity? How do we measure how inclusive a model is? And can we come up with international standards to measure that? Because I don't think we've got them at the moment, or we're trying to get them, and maybe it could be something out of this summit. If anything, could be how do we have that standard? And also, just on the last point as well, I think yes, we need to incentivize private sectors to develop inclusive and participatory models, but we also need to incentivize people to use them as well. So it's not just about, which, for example, in the UK government, should we be using country-specific large language models rather than just the generic ones that we're in today? We should be incentivized to use them, because then we get a more inclusive and participatory policy experience across the world as well. So just joining those two things together. Hopefully that was okay for my team. Is that?
Sorry, we're gonna have to move to the other group, but I appreciate the points.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please
Thank
do
you.
have this conversation after the
gonna
break.
continue.
Next group.
Who wants the volunteer?
Okay, so I'll start briefly with the discussion that happened in our group, and then, of course, anyone is free to add. So all of us agreed that the data set is very important. So that's where the participatory model should start. So we had the example of how there's caste hate speech and how there's caste misrepresentation in LLM models in India, and that originates from discriminatory data sets. Then we also talked about how in data sets, there can be the question of first misrepresentations, how indigenous communities are often misrepresented in the data that is collected to train LLM models. And then very linked to misrepresentation is also the question of self-determination from data. So some communities might want to be represented in a certain way in the data that is collected, but there might be some communities who do not want to be represented in data on AI. So having an informed choice and looking at participation as a human right is important. And then we also spoke about how there are small language models or regional language models that can perhaps include a participatory approach in a better way, and then have more representative data sets. We also talked about how dataset generation can, in dataset generation, the communities, especially marginalized communities, should not just be the providers of data set, but the owners of data sets. So they should be the controllers and owners of data sets. And finally, we also talked about the importance of evaluation and the importance of having communities in evaluation, the importance of understanding that there are cultural norms behind all languages, and hence a participatory model does not mean just having consultations and looking at communities as external stakeholders, but giving them the space in the system that they are insiders, so that they determine how the large language models are made and how data annotation, data collection is based on culture. And they are basically insiders in the creation of the large language models. If I've missed anything and anyone would like to add.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll go to the next group.
So, should I stand or? The question that we kind of talked about was how can we incentivize private sector led AI development to be inclusive and participatory? We were looking at the default things that most people think about is civil outcry, like making sure that people hold these companies responsible, these private sector level development, if they're not making things accessible, and regulation that the governments can put down, like accessibility guidelines, benchmarks, holding the companies to hold. But beyond that, it also helps to ensure that the money that's flowing in us is aligned, like raising funds from nonprofits, from impact-led funds, and also hiring such as the org culture remains value aligned, like making sure there's a lot of representation from all stakeholders that the AI might be affecting. One of the interesting things is also to note that if you only take profit to be your main thing, sometimes some of these diseases affect only a few people in the world, and if they had to fund the research into developing a cure for that research for the disease, you wouldn't be able to find that cure. So it's the same way AI should something that we all have a right to. So we cannot only lead as profit as the motive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then is there just one last contribution in the back row? Thank you.
We were talking about the first one, AI lifecycle. When we were discussing, we are thinking that the entire model design, development, evaluation, deployment, all the steps are important, and every single step, the multi-stakeholder engagement needs to happen. Because you might have a better data set, but the feature extraction or development might go wrong. Or when you're doing an evaluation, the questions what you ask might go wrong. So until or unless you have an iterative development similar to product, you cannot have something giving you same kind of results every time the AI evolves and every time the AI goes from one version to another version. So we would be going into a place where traditional systems are built by us, but in the next generation we might go to like machine to machine interaction, and a human will be observing the machine to machine interactions, and the data what it's collecting will be scrutinized at every single point of time, so that you know what is the interaction between a marginalized person or a well-educated person or a different sets of people. You know what kind of data is coming from a user point of view, and how the AI system is learning from a user point of view, and how it is evolving over a period of time from a user point of view.
Mhm.
So,
Thank you so much. So huge thank you to the audience. We're over time, but this has been a fascinating start to hopefully conversations you will continue to have in different sessions and in the corridor, and also hopefully with us. I'm just going to put up a slide right now with our email addresses, so please do stay in touch with us as we continue to do this work. I'm so sorry we're out of time. But two quick spotlights. I want to say these are our email addresses. Please do reach out. We're continuing to think about this. We're starting a project looking at trust and safety. What does it mean to have trust and safety in AI systems in low resource languages and contexts? And I also want to give a quick shout out to Marlena Wisniak's work on the framework for meaningful engagement at the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Reach out to us. We're happy to connect you with Marlena, but please do check out the framework for meaningful engagement, which spells out specific steps to foster this sort of participation and inclusivity that we've been discussing. Thank you again. Thank you to our panelists and co-organizers, and thank you to you. Bye-bye.